Sometimes the land we inherit carries more than memories. It carries souls we thought were lost forever. When 62-year-old Elan arrived at his uncle's abandoned ranch, he expected to find nothing but dust and debt. Instead, he discovered over 200 wild horses living in secret on the forgotten land. These weren't just any horses. They were descendants of the sacred herd his Apache ancestors once protected. Now developers want to buy the ranch and turn it into subdivisions. Elan faces a choice that will define his final years. Will he take the money and walk away from his heritage, or will he fight to protect the last free symbol of his people's spirit? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver band on Elan's weathered finger caught the morning light as he gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup. 3 years since Maria had slipped away in her sleep, and still he wore her wedding ring beside his own. The habit brought him comfort on days when the silence grew too heavy. Though lately those days came more often than not. He had been drifting since the funeral, staying with his sister on the Pine Ridge Reservation for a few months, then moving on to his cousin's place near Gallup when the well-meaning sympathy became too much to bear. Each move took him further from the life he'd built with Maria, further from the small house in Albuquerque where they'd planned to grow old together. Now at 62, he felt like a man without anchor, carrying everything he owned in the bed of his truck. The letter had found him at his nephew's trailer in Shiprock, forwarded 3 times through various relatives who'd tried to keep track of his wandering. The envelope bore the faded letterhead of Hawkins and Associates, attorneys at law, and inside was news that changed everything. His uncle Samuel had died, leaving him a ranch in the high desert country south of Santa Fe. Elan barely remembered Samuel. His father's older brother had always been the family mystery, the one who'd left the reservation as a young man and never quite came back. There had been occasional letters over the years, brief visits when Elan was still a boy, but Samuel had chosen a solitary life that kept him at the edges of family gatherings and tribal events. Now, following the lawyer's directions down a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere, Elan wondered what kind of inheritance awaited him. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, pinon and juniper dotting the rolling hills, red rock mesas rising like ancient monuments against the pale blue sky. This was country that got into a man's bones if he let it, the kind of place where silence had weight and the wind carried stories older than memory. The ranch materialized gradually through the desert haze. First came the mailbox, leaning drunkenly beside a cattle guard. Then a wooden sign, so weathered the words were barely visible, Crow's Rest Ranch, Esther 1924. The name stirred something in Elan's memory. Hadn't his grandfather mentioned this place once, in one of his rambling stories about the old days? The house sat like a tired old man in the middle of 200 acres of high desert. Adobe walls the color of dried earth, a corrugated metal roof showing patches of rust, and a wooden porch that sagged in the middle. Behind it stood a barn that had seen better decades, and beyond that, corrals with rails that looked ready to give up their fight against the elements. Elan parked beside the house and stepped out into the thin air. At nearly 7,000 feet elevation, every breath reminded him he wasn't in the lowlands anymore. The silence pressed against his eardrums. No traffic, no neighbors, just the whisper of wind through sage and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. He tried the front door first, surprised when it opened easily. The lawyer had mentioned that Samuel lived alone until the end, refusing help even when his health began to fail. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through grimy windows. The furniture was sparse but sturdy. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf filled with volumes on horses and ranching, and an old sofa covered with a Navajo blanket. On the mantelpiece above a stone fireplace, Elan found photographs in simple frames. Some showed a younger Samuel working with horses, others captured family gatherings from decades past. In one, Elan recognized his own father as a boy, standing beside Samuel and an older man who must have been their father. The photo stirred memories of stories told around winter fires, tales of horses and wide-open country, of relatives who'd chosen different paths through life. A knock at the door interrupted his exploration. Outside stood a man about his own age, wearing a weathered cowboy hat and the kind of boots that had seen real work. His face bore the deep lines that came from years of squinting into desert sun. "You must be Elan," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Tom Whitehorse. My place is about 5 miles east. I knew your uncle." They shook hands, and Tom's grip was firm, honest. "Sorry for your loss," he continued. "Samuel was a good neighbor. Kept to himself mostly, but you could count on him if trouble came calling." "I appreciate that," Elan said. "I'm still trying to figure out what he's left me here." Tom's eyes moved past him to scan the property. "More than you might expect. Samuel had a way with horses, better than any man I ever knew. There's something special about this place, something he spent 40 years protecting." Before Elan could ask what he meant, Tom was already walking toward his own truck. "If you need anything, tools, supplies, directions to town, just holler. Beth Martinez runs the feed store in Española. She'll set you up with whatever you need," and she knew Samuel better than most. After Tom left, Elan walked the property as shadows began to lengthen. The barn held old hay and equipment that belonged to another era. The corrals were sturdy despite their weathered appearance, built to last by someone who understood both horses and this harsh country. Water tanks were full, fed by a well that still pumped clear water from deep in the earth. As twilight painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Elan sat on the front porch and tried to make sense of his inheritance. The lawyer had mentioned that several parties were interested in buying the land. Developers who saw potential in the wide spaces and mountain views. The money would be substantial, enough to set him up comfortably for whatever years remained. But sitting there in the gathering dusk, listening to the profound silence of the high desert, Elan felt something he hadn't experienced since Maria's death, a sense of possibility. Maybe this place could be more than just a transaction to settle an estate. Maybe his uncle had left him something more valuable than money. The last light was fading when he heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. He stood, straining to see into the growing darkness, but saw nothing. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Horses running free across the mesa, their hooves drumming against the earth like heartbeats in the night. Tomorrow, he decided, he would explore further. Tonight, he would sleep in his uncle's house and try to understand what Samuel had really left him in this forgotten corner of New Mexico. Dawn came slowly to the high desert, painting the eastern mountains in shades of amber and rose. Elan had slept fitfully in his uncle's bed, unused to the profound silence and the way shadows moved across the walls as clouds drifted past the moon. He woke before sunrise, as was his habit, and made coffee in the small kitchen using grounds he'd found in Samuel's cupboard. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way his grandfather used to make it over campfires during hunting trips. Standing on the front porch with his cup, Elan watched the sun climb above the Sangre de Cristo mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The air was crisp and thin, carrying scents of sage and juniper and something else, something wild and free that he couldn't quite name. He was finishing his second cup when he heard it again, the sound that had puzzled him the night before. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming from the north. Elan set down his cup and walked toward the barn, following the sound that seemed to roll across the mesa like distant thunder. At the crest of a small rise behind the corrals, he stopped and stared. Below him, in a natural amphitheater carved by wind and water over countless centuries, moved a sight that took his breath away. Horses, dozens of them, maybe more than 100, grazed in the early morning light. Their coats caught the sun like burnished copper, deep bay, and rich chestnut. Some were nearly black, others the color of summer wheat, but it was their movement that told the real story. These weren't domestic horses grown soft from easy living. These animals moved with the fluid grace of creatures born to wild country, alert, muscled, their heads high and ears constantly moving. A large stallion, dark as storm clouds, stood sentinel on a rocky outcrop, his mane flowing in the morning breeze as he surveyed his domain. Elan had grown up around horses. His grandfather had taught him to ride before he could properly walk, had shown him the old ways of gentling wild ponies and reading their language. But he had never seen anything like this. A herd of this size, living completely free in country most people would consider too harsh to support such numbers. He made his way carefully down the slope, moving slowly to avoid spooking the animals. The closer he got, the more remarkable they appeared. These weren't the feral horses he'd seen on other ranges, descendants of domestic animals gone wild. These horses had something different in their bearing, something that spoke of bloodlines preserved across generations. The herd became aware of him gradually. Heads lifted, ears pricked forward, but they didn't scatter in panic as domestic horses might have. Instead, they regarded him with cautious interest, as if they recognized something familiar in his scent or movement. The stallion descended from his rocky perch and approached to within 50 yards. Close enough for Elan to see the intelligence in his dark eyes and the scars that spoke of battles fought and won. Easy. "Brother," Elan murmured, using words his grandfather had taught him decades ago. "I'm not here to harm you." As if responding to the ancient language, the stallion whickered softly and tossed his head. For a moment that stretched like eternity, man and horse regarded each other across the divide that separated their worlds. Then the stallion turned and trotted back to his herd, and the moment was broken. Elan spent the morning observing from a respectful distance, counting roughly 200 animals of various ages and colors. The herd dynamics fascinated him, the way the mares protected their foals, how the young stallions tested their place in the hierarchy, the ancient dance of dominance and submission that governed their society. It wasn't until he walked back toward the barn that he made his second discovery of the day. Hanging from a peg in the tack room was a bridle unlike any he'd ever seen. The leather was old but well-maintained, braided in patterns he recognized from his grandfather's stories. Worked into the leather were symbols, the 4 directions, the sacred mountain, designs that spoke of Apache craftsmanship and spiritual significance. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the bridle down. This wasn't just any piece of equipment. This was a ceremonial bridle, the kind used in the horse ceremonies his great-grandfather had participated in before the army scattered his people to reservations. His fingers traced the intricate beadwork, each pattern telling part of a story he was only beginning to understand. A note fell from behind the bridle, written in his uncle's careful hand, "For Elan, when he's ready to remember who he really is. Samuel." That afternoon, he drove to town with more questions than answers. Española drowsed in the desert heat, its adobe buildings and narrow streets, unchanged by the passing decades. The feed store Tom had mentioned stood on the main street, its weathered sign promising everything for the working ranch. Inside, he found a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, organizing inventory behind the counter. She looked up as he entered, and he saw recognition flicker across her features. "You're Samuel's nephew," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Beth Martinez. Tom called and said you'd made it in." "Elan Yazzie," he replied, shaking her hand. "I'm trying to understand what my uncle left me out there." Beth's expression grew thoughtful. "Samuel was a special man. Most folks in town thought he was just a hermit with too many horses, but he was protecting something important. How much do you know about your family history?" "Some. My grandfather told stories, but—" "Come back here," Beth said, leading him to a small office behind the counter. She pulled out a folder thick with papers and photographs. "Your uncle and I researched this together over the years. Those horses on his land aren't just any Mustangs." She spread out photographs that took Elan's breath away, images of Apache horse ceremonies from the early 1900s, government documents about treaty rights, and genealogical charts that traced bloodlines back over a century. "These horses," Beth continued, "are direct descendants of the herds your people rode in the old days. When the army forced the Apache onto reservations, some of the horses escaped to this country. Samuel's grandfather, your great-grandfather, made a promise to protect them. Samuel spent 40 years keeping that promise. Elan stared at the photographs, seeing in them the same fluid grace he'd witnessed that morning. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Samuel was waiting for the right time. He said you'd know when you were ready to come home." Beth closed the folder and handed it to him. "The question now is what you're going to do about it. There are people who'd pay good money for horses like these, and others who'd pay even more for the land they live on." That evening, as Elan sat on his uncle's porch, watching the sun set behind the western mesas, he felt the weight of generations pressing on his shoulders. Somewhere out in the gathering darkness, 200 horses moved through, country their ancestors had claimed as home long before fences divided. The earth into parcels of ownership. The promise his great-grandfather had made wasn't just about horses. It was about remembering who they were, about keeping alive something that couldn't be bought or sold or reduced to dollars and cents. The beaded medicine pouch felt warm against Elan's palm as he stood at his grandfather's grave 3 days later. He'd driven 4 hours to the small cemetery outside Dulcie, needing answers that only the dead could provide. The headstone was simple granite, bearing his grandfather's name in English and Apache, Joseph Yazzie, man who speaks with horses. Elan knelt and placed tobacco at the base of the stone. Speaking in the old language his grandfather had insisted he learn. "Grandfather, I need your guidance. The horses you told me about in your stories, they're real, and they're waiting for me to decide their fate." The wind stirred through the pines, and for a moment Elan could almost hear the old man's voice telling stories around winter fires. His grandfather had been the keeper of memories, the one who held the family's history in his heart and passed it down through words and ceremony. In his coat pocket, Elan carried the medicine pouch his grandfather had given him on his 18th birthday, sacred herbs and stones blessed in the old way, meant to provide guidance in difficult times. Driving back to the ranch, Elan's mind churned with memories and obligations. His grandfather's stories had always seemed like ancient history, tales from a world that no longer existed. Now he understood they were instructions, a roadmap for a responsibility he'd inherited along with Samuel's land. The first thing he did upon returning was walk out to observe the horses again. They had moved to a different part of the range, following water and grass in patterns established over generations. The dark stallion, Elan had begun thinking of him as Stormwalker, watched from his usual vantage point as the herd grazed in the afternoon sun. Elan began that day what would become a daily ritual. Using the knowledge his grandfather had taught him, he approached the herd slowly, always from downwind, never making direct eye contact that might be interpreted as a challenge. He spoke softly in Apache, the words his grandfather had used when gentling wild horses decades ago. The horses gradually accepted his presence. The mares no longer moved their foals away when he appeared, and some of the younger animals began to show curiosity about this strange human who smelled of sage and spoke their language. Stormwalker remained aloof but watchful, clearly the intelligence that governed the herd's decisions. On his 4th day back, Elan began repairing the ranch infrastructure. The corrals needed new rails, the water systems required attention, and the barn roof had developed several leaks over the years. The work felt good, physical labor that quieted his mind and gave purpose to his days. As he mended fence posts and replaced boards, he found himself talking to Maria, sharing his confusion and growing attachment to this place she'd never seen. "You'd love it here," he told her picture, which he'd placed on the kitchen table. "Remember how you used to talk about having horses someday? About living somewhere we could see the stars without city lights. This is that place, Maria. I think maybe Uncle Samuel knew that." The work was interrupted on the 5th day by the arrival of a white sedan that looked distinctly out of place on the dirt road. The man who emerged wore an expensive suit and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He was perhaps 50, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. Mr. Yazzie. I'm Marcus Steele, Steele Development Corporation. He extended a manicured hand. I understand you've inherited this property. Elan wiped his hands on his jeans before shaking. That's right. I represent a group of investors interested in developing this area. The views are spectacular, and we're only 90 minutes from Santa Fe. This could be prime real estate for vacation homes, maybe a resort development. Steele pulled out a folder thick with documents and photographs. The images showed computer-generated renderings of luxury homes dotting the landscape, golf courses carved from the desert, and swimming pools gleaming like blue jewels against the red earth. We're prepared to make a very generous offer, Steele continued, producing a contract. $2.5 million cash with a 30-day closing period. You could be on a beach in Hawaii by Christmas. Elan stared at the number written on the contract. $2.5 million, more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to buy a house anywhere, to live comfortably for the rest of his life, without worrying about money or work or responsibility. What about the horses? He asked. Steele's smile flickered. Horses? I wasn't aware there were any horses on the property. There are about 200 wild horses that live here. They've been here for generations. Well, that's easily handled. The BLM has programs for relocating wild horse populations. Or there are private buyers who'd pay good money for Mustangs. Either way, it's not really a problem. The casual dismissal of the horse's fate hit Elan like a physical blow. They're not just Mustangs. They're Apache horses, descendants of herds my people have protected for over a century. Steele's expression grew impatient. Mr. Yazzie, with respect, these animals have no legal protection. Once you own the property, you can do whatever you want with them. But they can't be allowed to interfere with development plans worth millions of dollars. After Steele left, promising to call within a week for an answer, Elan walked out to the mesa where Stormwalker kept his vigil. The stallion seemed to sense his turmoil, moving closer than ever before, close enough that Elan could see the old scars along his neck and the wisdom in his dark eyes. What would you do, brother? Elan asked softly. If someone offered you comfort and safety, but you had to abandon your family to get it. That evening, he called his sister Anna on the reservation. She listened without interruption as he described the inheritance, the horses, and Steele's offer. $2.5 million, she said finally. Elan, that's more money than our family has ever seen. You could help so many people, I know. But these horses, Anna, they're not just animals. They're the last free piece of our grandfather's world. Grandfather's been dead for 20 years. The world has changed, has it? Or have we just forgotten who we're supposed to be? The conversation ended without resolution, but Elan knew his sister's practical concerns were valid. He was 62 years old, with no children to inherit whatever he might build here. The horses would outlive him, but what then? Without legal protection, without someone to continue Samuel's work, they'd eventually end up exactly where Steele planned to put them, scattered to the winds or sold to the highest bidder. As he prepared for bed, Elan touched the medicine pouch hanging around his neck and spoke a prayer his grandfather had taught him. Help me see the path, ancestors. Help me choose with wisdom, not just with my heart. Outside his window, coyotes sang to the rising moon, and somewhere in the darkness, 200 horses moved through dreams as old as the earth itself. The yellowed documents in the tribal offices smelled of dust and old paper, but they contained revelations that changed everything Elan thought he knew about his inheritance. Rose Crow Feather, the tribal council's cultural preservation officer, spread the papers across her desk with reverent care. Your great-grandfather was more than just a horse trainer, she said, her voice carrying the weight of years. He was one of the negotiators who worked with the government after the Apache Wars ended. These treaties from 1924 specifically mention protection rights for sacred sites and traditional practices. Elan leaned forward, studying the faded typescript. The legal language was dense and archaic, but certain phrases stood out. Traditional grazing areas, cultural preservation, ancestral practices involving horse ceremonies. The land your uncle owned was included in these protections, Rose continued. It was designated as a cultural preservation area, meant to maintain traditional Apache relationships with horses. The fact that it's remained in your family all these years isn't coincidence. It's obligation. She pulled out more documents, including photographs that made Elan's breath catch. His great-grandfather stood with a group of Apache leaders, all wearing traditional dress, with horses visible in the background. In one image, a young man who could only be Samuel held the reins of a paint pony, his face serious beyond his years. Samuel knew this history, Rose said. He came to see me several times over the years, always asking about the old agreements, the responsibilities that came with the land. He was preparing for the day when he'd have to pass the guardianship to someone else. Guardianship? That's what this is, Elan. Not ownership in the way white law understands it. Guardianship. Your family holds that land in trust for the horses, for the ancestors, for the future generations who might need to remember what freedom looks like. The drive back to the ranch took Elan through country that seemed different now, charged with new meaning. Every mesa and canyon had been shaped by the passage of horses and the people who lived alongside them. The responsibility felt overwhelming, not just for the horses themselves, but for everything they represented. That afternoon, he began what Samuel's journals called the approach, the careful process of earning the herd's trust. Using techniques passed down through generations of Apache horsemen, Elan positioned himself where the horses could see him clearly, but didn't feel threatened. He carried the scent of sage and sweetgrass, plants the horses associated with ceremony and safety. Stormwalker was the key. As the dominant stallion, his acceptance would influence the entire herd's response. Elan spent hours simply being present, allowing the great horse to study him from a distance. Gradually, the distance decreased. Stormwalker's curiosity seemed stronger than his caution. On the third day of these sessions, something remarkable happened. A young mare, heavy with foal, approached within 20 feet of where Elan sat. She was the color of winter wheat, with intelligent eyes and the fluid movement that marked her as one of the special ones. As she grazed, her foal moved inside her, and Elan felt a profound connection to the cycle of life continuing in this ancient place. He named her Dawn Singer for the way she moved in the morning light. The peaceful routine was shattered by the arrival of 2 trucks and a horse trailer. Marcus Steele emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by 3 men in work clothes who looked like they knew their way around livestock. Elan met them at the ranch gate, his jaw tight with apprehension. "Mr. Yazzie," Steele said, his smile as artificial as before. "I hope you've had time to consider our offer. I've brought some associates who specialize in wild horse management just to assess the situation. I told you I needed more time to decide. Of course, but time is money in development, and my investors are eager to move forward. These gentlemen can help us understand what we're dealing with regarding the horse population." One of the men stepped forward, a lean cowboy with cold eyes and the kind of mustache that belonged in old westerns. "Name's Clayton Webb. I run captures for the BLM and private contractors. How many head you figure are out there?" "I'm not sure that's any of your business," Elan replied. Webb's smile was predatory. "Well, if Mr. Steele buys this property, it becomes my business. Those horses will need to be removed before any development can proceed. Better to get a count now, maybe separate the good breeding stock from the culls." The casual way Webb spoke about culls made Elan's stomach turn. These men saw the horses as units to be processed, problems to be solved. They had no understanding of what they represented, no respect for the life and freedom that moved across the mesa like wind made visible. "Gentlemen," Elan said carefully, "I haven't made any decision about selling. Until I do, I'd appreciate it if you'd respect my property and leave the horses alone." Steele's expression hardened. "Mr. Yazzie, let me be direct. Development in this area is inevitable. If not us, then someone else. The difference is we're offering you the chance to profit from it. But our offer won't remain open indefinitely." After they left, Elan found himself shaking with anger and something deeper, a protective instinct he hadn't felt since Maria's illness, when he'd fought the insurance companies and hospitals to ensure she received the best care possible. The horses couldn't advocate for themselves. They depended on him to stand between them and people who saw them only as obstacles or commodities. That evening, he called Tom Whitehorse, needing to talk to someone who understood both the land and the pressures he faced. "Steele's been sniffing around this area for 5 years, Tom said when Elan described the visit. "He's already bought 3 smaller ranches north of you, pushed out families who'd been there for generations. His idea of development is about as subtle as a bulldozer." "What would you do, Tom?" "That's not for me to say, but I'll tell you this. Your uncle turned down offers before, bigger offers than what Steele's making. Samuel knew something we're all just beginning to understand." "What's that?" "That some things are worth more than money. That some responsibilities can't be bought and sold." That night, Elan walked out to where the horses gathered to drink from the natural spring that had drawn them to this country for centuries. Stormwalker stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and for a moment, Elan could almost see the generations of horses that had come before, the war ponies that had carried Apache warriors, the gentle mares that had taught children to ride, the stallions that had defended their families against all threats. Dawn Singer moved carefully in the moonlight, her unborn foal a promise of continuity that stretched both backward and forward through time. Watching her, Elan understood that this wasn't just about horses or money or development rights. This was about keeping faith with ancestors who had entrusted their descendants with something sacred. The decision was beginning to crystallize in his heart, though his practical mind still wrestled with doubts. $2.5 million could solve many problems, could secure his own future and help his family, but it couldn't restore what would be lost when the bulldozers came and the horses were scattered to feed lots and private collections. Some things once broken could never be repaired. Maria's journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with dreams written in her careful handwriting. Elan had found it while searching through boxes he'd stored in Samuel's closet, personal belongings he'd packed after her funeral, but never found the courage to examine. Now, 3 weeks into his residence at the ranch, he finally felt strong enough to face her words. April 15th, one entry read, "Elan seems happier when we talk about horses. His grandfather's stories light something in his eyes that I wish I could see more often. Sometimes I dream about having a place with horses, somewhere we could wake up to the sound of running water and wind through grass instead of traffic and sirens." Her words hit him like a physical blow. Maria had wanted this exact life he'd stumbled into through inheritance and circumstance. She dreamed of horses and open country while they lived in their suburban house, surrounded by neighbors and noise. Why hadn't he known? Why hadn't she told him? June 3rd, Elan's been working too hard again. I wish I could make him understand that money isn't everything. I'd rather live in a trailer on beautiful land than a mansion in the city. Life is so short. Why do we spend it chasing things that don't feed our souls? The irony was almost cruel. Here he sat in exactly the kind of place Maria had dreamed about, faced with the choice between honoring her secret wishes and securing the financial future she'd worried about during her illness. The medical bills had consumed their savings, and even with insurance, her treatment had left them with debts that still haunted his sleep. A knock at the door interrupted his reading. Through the window, he saw a small pickup truck and a woman with silver-streaked hair walking toward the house. She looked familiar, though he couldn't place her immediately. "Mr. Yazzie, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian from Hispaniola. Beth Martinez said you might need someone to look at your horses." Elan stepped onto the porch, grateful for the distraction from Maria's journal. "I'm not sure they're exactly my horses, Dr. Chen. They're wild animals that happen to live on my land." Sarah smiled, and he noticed the way it transformed her entire face. She was perhaps 55, with the kind of natural beauty that came from years of working outdoors and finding joy in simple things. Please call me Sarah, and from what I understand, those horses are more yours than anyone else's. May I see them? As they walked toward the mesa where the herd typically grazed, Sarah explained her background. She'd grown up on a ranch in Colorado, earned her veterinary degree at Colorado State, and spent 20 years in private practice before moving to New Mexico to work with wild horse populations. Beth told me about the bloodlines, she said, as they climbed the rise. If what she suspects is true, these horses represent a genetic treasure that's been lost almost everywhere else. When they crested the hill, Sarah stopped abruptly. Below them, the herd moved in the late afternoon light, like living poetry. Storm Walker stood sentinel while mares grazed with their foals, and young stallions played the eternal games of dominance and speed that had entertained horses for millennia. "My God," Sarah breathed. "I've never seen anything like this." She pulled out binoculars and began a careful study of individual animals. Her professional excitement was infectious as she pointed out conformational details that spoke to their heritage. The distinctive head shape, the arch of neck, the way they moved with the efficiency born of desert survival. "These aren't just Apache horses," she said finally. "These are foundation bloodlines. Some of these animals carry genetics that have been bred out of domestic populations for over a century." As if sensing her appreciation, several horses moved closer to their vantage point. Dawnsinger, now obviously close to foaling, gazed up at them with curious intelligence. Sarah gasped when she saw the pregnant mare. That mare, her conformation is textbook Apache pony. If her foal inherits her qualities and the stallion's strength, it could be one of the most genetically valuable horses in North America. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles. 2 trucks appeared on the horizon, moving fast across the desert floor toward the herd. Elan recognized one as belonging to Clayton Webb, the horse contractor who'd accompanied Steele's previous visit. "What are they doing?" Sarah asked. Before Elan could answer, the truck separated and began a coordinated approach toward the horses. It was clearly a capture attempt, an illegal one, since they were on his property without permission. The herd reacted immediately, with Stormwalker's warning call sending mares and foals into defensive positions. "They're trying to capture them," Elan said, already running down the slope. "Those bastards are trying to steal my horses." Sarah followed, her veterinary bag bouncing as she ran. Below them, the scene unfolded like a nightmare. The trucks had separated the herd, and men with ropes were attempting to capture individual animals. Dawnsinger, heavy with foal, struggled to keep up with the other mares as they fled toward the canyon. Elan reached his truck and grabbed the shotgun Samuel had kept behind the seat. He'd learned to shoot as a boy, but he'd never imagined using a weapon to protect horses. As he approached the chaos, he fired a warning shot into the air. "Get off my land," he shouted. "You're trespassing." Webb looked up from where he was attempting to rope a young stallion. "Mr. Yazzie!" "We're just securing these animals before they cause problems." "Steele said you'd agreed to the sale." Steele lied. "I haven't agreed to anything, and you're stealing my horses." "These aren't your horses," Webb replied, his rope still in hand. "These are unbranded wild animals on open range." "This isn't open range. This is private property, and you're trespassing." The standoff lasted only moments before Webb's partner called out a warning. In the distance, sirens wailed. Sarah had called the sheriff's department on her cell phone. The would-be rustlers quickly loaded their equipment and drove away, leaving the herd scattered and agitated. It took an hour for the horses to calm down and regroup. During that time, Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos took statements and confirmed that charges would be filed for trespassing and attempted theft. Sarah examined several horses for stress-related injuries, finding only minor cuts and scrapes. "This won't be the last attempt," Deputy Santos warned as she prepared to leave. "If these horses are as valuable as Dr. Chen says, word will spread. You might want to consider some kind of security system." That evening, Elan and Sarah sat on the front porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the mesas in shades of gold and crimson. The day's events had created an unexpected bond between them, the kind of alliance that forms when people face danger together. "I have a confession," Sarah said as twilight deepened. "I didn't just come here because Beth asked me to. I've been researching Apache horse bloodlines for 15 years, trying to trace what happened to the original herds. Finding these horses, it's like discovering a lost tribe of people." Elan studied her profile in the gathering darkness. There was something about her presence that felt both comfortable and exciting. The first time since Maria's death that he'd felt drawn to another person's company. "What happens now?" he asked. "That depends on what you want to happen. These horses need protection, legal protection, physical protection, genetic protection. But that's going to require resources and commitment. And if I can't provide those things—" Sarah turned to face him, her eyes serious in the lamplight. "Then something irreplaceable will be lost forever. And I don't think either of us could live with that." As if in response to her words, Stormwalker's call echoed across the mesa, a sound as old as the wind, as enduring as the mountains, and as fragile as the promises people make to protect what they love. The hand-drawn map, hidden behind Samuel's bedroom dresser, revealed secrets that changed everything Elan thought he knew about the ranch. Sarah held one corner while he smoothed the other, both of them studying the careful notations his uncle had made over decades of observation. "Look at this," Sarah said, tracing a network of trails marked in different colored inks. "These aren't random paths. This shows seasonal migration routes, water sources, safe areas for foaling. Your uncle documented their entire ecosystem. The map covered not just Elan's inherited property, but thousands of acres of surrounding land, some private, some federal, some belonging to the Pueblo. Samuel had marked water holes that existed only during certain seasons, high pastures the horses used for summer grazing, and winter shelters in protected canyons. Most importantly, he'd identified corridors the horses used to move between these areas, ancient pathways that predated fences and property lines. This is why Webb's capture attempt failed so quickly, Elan realized. The horses know this country better than any human. They have escape routes planned for every situation. Samuel's notes covered 40 years of careful observation. He'd recorded foaling seasons, noted which bloodlines produced the strongest offspring, and tracked the herd's natural population control mechanisms. Most remarkably, he documented their relationship with other wildlife, how they shared water sources with elk and antelope, how their grazing patterns actually improved the range for other species. Your uncle was conducting the most comprehensive wild horse study ever done, Sarah said, awe evident in her voice. This data is invaluable for understanding how these animals lived before human interference. A sharp knock interrupted their examination of the map. Marcus Steele stood on the porch, flanked by two men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of quiet authority that comes with serious money. Steele's previous friendliness had been replaced by barely controlled impatience. "Mr. Yazzie, we need to talk. I understand there was some trouble yesterday with unauthorized personnel on your property." "That's right. Your friend Webb tried to steal my horses. I assure you, Mr. Webb was acting without my knowledge or authorization. But the incident highlights exactly why development of this property needs to proceed quickly. Wild horses are attractive nuisances that create liability issues." One of the suits stepped forward. "Mr. Yazzie, I'm James Morrison, legal counsel for Steel Development. We've done some research into the status of this property, and I'm afraid there are complications you may not be aware of." Morrison produced a briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Your uncle's will leaves the property to you, but there are outstanding liens and back taxes that total nearly $400,000. The estate must settle these debts within 90 days, or the property reverts to the county for tax sale." The number hit Elan like a physical blow. $400,000. More money than he'd ever had access to. Certainly more than he could raise in 3 months. He thought of his meager savings, barely enough to live on for a year, even without property taxes and legal fees. "However," Morrison continued smoothly, "our offer remains open. We'll handle all outstanding debts as part of the purchase agreement. You walk away with 2 million in cash, free and clear." After they left, Elan sat in stunned silence while Sarah examined the legal documents they'd provided. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she read through the dense legal language. "It's legitimate," she said finally. "Samuel apparently stopped paying property taxes 7 years ago. The liens include unpaid bills for veterinary care, feed supplies, and equipment purchases. He was spending everything he had to care for the horses. The irony was bitter. Samuel had bankrupted himself protecting the herd, and now his financial sacrifice threatened to accomplish exactly what he'd spent his life preventing. Without money to pay the debts, Elan would lose the property, and the horses would face capture or slaughter. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. James Rivers arrived in a dusty jeep, introducing himself as a wildlife biologist from the University of New Mexico. He was younger than Elan expected, perhaps 40, with the enthusiasm of someone whose work was also his passion. "Dr. Chen contacted me about your horses," he explained. "I've been studying wild horse populations throughout the Southwest, and what you have here is extraordinary." Rivers had brought equipment to conduct genetic testing, a process that involved collecting hair samples from individual animals without disturbing them. As they walked among the herd, he explained the significance of what they were seeing. "Most wild horse populations show significant genetic bottlenecking," he said, carefully collecting samples. "Inbreeding, loss of diversity, health problems. But these animals show no sign of genetic depression. Their bloodlines have remained remarkably pure." Stormwalker allowed Rivers to approach within 30 feet, closer than the stallion had permitted any stranger. The great horse seemed to understand that this human posed no threat. Perhaps sensing the same respectful attitude that Elan's grandfather had taught was essential for working with wild animals. "If genetic testing confirms what I suspect," Rivers continued, "these horses could be classified as a distinct population segment under federal protection laws. That would make their habitat a protected area regardless of who owns the land." The possibility of federal protection offered hope, but Rivers cautioned that the classification process could take years. "You'd need to maintain the population in the meantime," he said. "And there would be challenges from development interests with political connections." That evening, as if sensing the weight of decisions pressing on their guardian, the horses moved closer to the ranch buildings than ever before. Dawnsinger, now enormous with her approaching foal, grazed within sight of the house. Stormwalker stood on his usual rocky outcrop, but his attention seemed focused on the human structures rather than scanning for distant threats. Elan found himself walking among them in the twilight, speaking softly in Apache as his grandfather had taught him. The horses no longer moved away from his presence. Some of the younger animals showed curiosity about this strange human who smelled of sage and spoke in the old language. Sarah joined him as full darkness fell, bringing coffee and the comfortable silence of someone who understood the weight of the moment. They stood together, watching the horses move like shadows in the starlight. Creatures caught between worlds, the ancient freedom their ancestors had known, and the modern reality of fences and legal documents, and men who saw them as problems to be solved. "We could fight this," Sarah said finally. "If the genetic testing supports Rivers' theory, we could apply for emergency protection status. It's a long shot, but it might buy us time, and if it doesn't work, then we find another way. These horses have survived everything: war, displacement, capture attempts, droughts, harsh winters. They've persisted because people like your uncle and your great-grandfather believed they were worth protecting." As if responding to their conversation, Stormwalker descended from his rocky perch and approached to within 20 feet of where they stood. In the moonlight, his scars were visible, evidence of battles fought and won, of a life lived on his own terms, despite the pressures of a world that offered him no safe harbor. "Some things are worth fighting for," Elan said, understanding finally that this wasn't just about horses or money or property rights. It was about keeping faith with promises made by ancestors who'd understood that certain responsibilities transcend individual convenience. The decision was crystallizing in his heart, though he knew the path ahead would be neither easy nor certain. The DNA test results arrived on a morning when frost painted the high desert silver, and Dawn Singer's foal chose to make its entrance into the world. Sarah had been staying at the ranch for 3 days, monitoring the pregnant mare's condition, and both she and Elan were present. When the birth began in the pre-dawn darkness, the foal emerged as the sun crested the eastern mountains, a perfect colt with his mother's wheat-colored coat and his father's powerful build. Stormwalker stood guard nearby, his proud demeanor suggesting he knew the significance of this newest addition to his herd. As Sarah examined the newborn, her excitement was palpable. "He's perfect," she whispered, checking the colt's breathing and reflexes. "No defects, strong vital signs, excellent conformation. This little guy represents 500 years of careful breeding." It was while they watched the colt take his first steps that Dr. Rivers arrived with the genetic test results. His expression was a mixture of excitement and disbelief as he spread the laboratory reports across the hood of his Jeep. "Elan, these results are extraordinary. We've identified genetic markers that trace directly back to horses brought to North America by Spanish conquistadors. But more than that," he paused, scanning the technical data. "These horses carry specific genetic signatures that connect them to war ponies owned by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and other famous chiefs." Sarah looked up from examining the newborn colt. "Are you saying these horses are related to the most famous war ponies in Native American history?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. The bloodlines intermingled during the 19th century when tribes traded horses across tribal boundaries. Your ancestors didn't just protect any wild horses, they preserved the genetic legacy of the most prized war ponies of the Plains Indian Wars." The revelation hit Elan like a physical blow. These weren't just Apache horses, they were living links to the greatest mounted warriors in American history. Their value transcended anything he'd imagined, but it also meant the threats against them would intensify exponentially. Rivers continued reading from the genetic analysis. Some of these animals carry bloodlines that were thought to be completely extinct. Museums would pay millions for genetic material from horses like these. Collectors would... He stopped abruptly, his expression changing as he read something that made him pale. "Elan, when exactly did your uncle die?" 6 weeks ago. "Heart attack according to the death certificate. Why?" Rivers showed them a document from the bottom of the folder, a toxicology report he'd requested from the county coroner. "I've been investigating suspicious deaths connected to wild horse advocacy. Your uncle's blood showed traces of oleander poisoning." The words seemed to hang in the thin mountain air. Oleander poisoning, a method that would cause symptoms identical to heart failure, nearly impossible to detect without specific testing. Someone had murdered Samuel to get access to the horses. Who else knew about the genetic significance? Elan asked, his voice tight with anger. "Very few people. The initial samples were sent to a private lab in Denver that specializes in equine genetics. But..." Rivers paused, checking his notes. "The lab was contacted 3 weeks ago by someone claiming to represent the estate, asking for detailed results to be sent to Steel Development Corporation. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Marcus Steele hadn't just happened to learn about the property becoming available. He'd known about the horse's true value before Samuel died, had probably been pressuring Samuel to sell for months or years. When Samuel refused, Steele had arranged his murder. "We need to call the FBI," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "This is murder, conspiracy, federal crimes involving Native American treaty rights." Before anyone could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed across the mesa. Multiple trucks were converging on the ranch from different directions, not the casual approach of neighbors or officials, but the coordinated movement of people with hostile intent. Elan grabbed the binoculars and counted at least 6 vehicles, including horse trailers and what looked like helicopter support vehicles. "They're coming for the horses," he said grimly. "And they're not planning to leave witnesses." Rivers was already on his satellite phone, calling federal authorities, but they all knew help was at least an hour away. The horses had scattered at the sound of approaching engines, their survival instincts triggered by decades of avoiding human threats. Stormwalker gathered his herd and began moving them toward the hidden canyon Samuel's map had shown, the ultimate refuge that had protected them for generations. "We need to follow them," Elan said, grabbing his grandfather's rifle from the house. "If Steele's people get between the horses and the canyon, they'll be trapped." Sarah collected her veterinary supplies, while Rivers secured the genetic test results in a waterproof container. As they prepared to leave, Elan paused at Samuel's dresser and took out the ceremonial war paint his grandfather had given him decades ago. Red ochre and white clay mixed with sacred herbs, the colors Apache warriors had worn when protecting their people. The paint felt warm as he applied it to his face in the traditional patterns his grandfather had taught him. If he was going to fight for his ancestors' horses, he would do it with their blessing and in their honor. The three of them set out on foot, following the ancient trails that connected the ranch to the hidden canyon. Behind them, vehicles spread across the mesa like a mechanized wolf pack, cutting off escape routes and forcing the horses toward predetermined capture points. But the horses knew this country in ways their pursuers could never understand. Stormwalker led his herd through passages between rocks that seemed impossibly narrow, up slopes that would challenge mountain goats, into country where vehicles couldn't follow and men on foot would struggle to navigate. As they climbed toward the canyon entrance, Elan could see the scope of Steele's operation. This wasn't a simple capture attempt. It was a military-style assault involving helicopters, all-terrain vehicles, and enough personnel to surround and contain the entire herd. The horses' genetic value had transformed them from wild animals into prizes worth millions of dollars. "They've been planning this for months," Rivers observed, watching the coordinated movements below. "This level of organization requires significant funding and detailed intelligence." The first helicopter appeared as they reached the canyon rim, its rotors echoing off the red rock walls like thunder. The horses below moved in tight formation, Stormwalker keeping them together through the chaos of noise and mechanical terror they'd never experienced before. Elan found himself praying in Apache, using words his grandfather had taught him for times of great danger. The horses represented more than genetic heritage or financial value. They were the last free embodiment of his people's relationship with the land. The final proof that not everything had been conquered and commodified. As the helicopter circled lower, preparing to drive the horses back toward the waiting capture teams, Elan made a decision that would define everything that followed. Taking his grandfather's rifle, he aimed carefully and fired a warning shot that echoed across the canyon like a war cry. The battle for the last free horses had begun, and he intended to fight it with everything his ancestors had taught him about protecting what could not be replaced. The sacred war paint dried on Elan's face as he, Sarah, and Dr. Rivers made their desperate way toward the hidden canyon. Behind them, Steele's operation unfolded with military precision, helicopters coordinating with ground teams, radio chatter crackling through the thin mountain air, and the systematic closing of escape routes that had protected the horses for generations. But the horses knew this country in ways their pursuers could never match. Stormwalker led his herd through passages that seemed impossible, narrow defiles between towering rocks, hidden trails that wound through dense stands of juniper and pinon. The great stallion moved with the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent in this harsh landscape, every decision calculated to keep his family safe. There, Rivers pointed toward a fold in the red rock cliffs. That must be the entrance to Samuel's Sanctuary Canyon. The hidden entrance was barely visible, even when you knew where to look. A crack in the rock face that opened into a natural corridor leading deep into the mesa. Samuel's map had marked it as the ultimate refuge, a place where water flowed year-round and grass grew thick in protected meadows hidden from the outside world. As they climbed higher, following deer trails and ancient footpaths, the scope of the threat below became clear. Steele hadn't just brought horse wranglers. This was a paramilitary operation. Men in tactical gear moved with the efficiency of professionals, and the equipment was worth millions. Someone with serious resources wanted these horses badly enough to commit murder and organize what amounted to an armed invasion. Federal authorities are an hour out, Rivers reported, checking his satellite communicator. FBI is taking this seriously because of the tribal treaty violations, but they're coming from Albuquerque. An hour might as well be a lifetime. In 60 minutes, Steele's people could capture or scatter the herd, eliminate witnesses, and disappear with horses worth tens of millions of dollars to the right buyers. The genetic heritage that had taken centuries to preserve could be lost in a single morning. The first helicopter swooped low over the canyon entrance, its rotor wash stirring clouds of red dust and sending smaller rocks tumbling down the cliff face. The pilot was trying to drive the horses back toward the waiting ground teams, but Stormwalker refused to panic. Instead, he led his herd deeper into the canyon's protective embrace. He's done this before, Sarah observed, watching the stallion's tactical retreat. Samuel must have practiced this evacuation route with them. The realization hit Elan with profound sadness. His uncle had known this day would come, had spent years preparing for the moment when the horses' sanctuary would be discovered and invaded. Every trail on Samuel's map, every hidden water source and emergency shelter, had been chosen with this ultimate confrontation in mind. As they reached the canyon rim, Elan could see the entire drama unfolding below. Nearly 200 horses moved through the protected valley like a river of living gold, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. Mares protected their foals, while young stallions flanked the herd's movement, creating defensive formations that spoke to thousands of years of evolution. But the pursuers were closing in. Ground teams had found ways to access the canyon floor, and men with tranquilizer guns were taking positions along the horses' escape routes. The operation was designed to capture the animals alive. Their genetic value was too precious to risk with fatal methods. "We need to create a distraction," Elan said, studying the tactical situation. "Something to buy time until the federal agents arrive." Rivers was documenting everything with a digital camera, creating evidence of the illegal capture operation. If we can prove these horses are being taken by force from tribal treaty land, it becomes a federal crime with serious penalties. Sarah had a different concern. That newborn colt can't handle a prolonged chase. If they push the herd too hard, we could lose him. And maybe Dawn's Singer too. The sound of approaching vehicles from behind made them all turn. More of Steele's people were coming up the back trails, cutting off their own escape route. Whatever they were going to do, it had to happen immediately. Elan thought of his grandfather's stories about Apache warriors who'd fought impossible odds to protect their people. Those men had understood that some battles were worth fighting, even when victory seemed impossible. The horses represented the last free embodiment of everything his ancestors had valued: courage, independence, and the refusal to surrender what made life worth living. "I'm going down there," he announced, checking his grandfather's rifle. "Those horses have been under my family's protection for over a century. I'm not going to let them be stolen while I hide on a cliff." "That's suicide," Rivers protested. "There are at least 20 armed men down there. Then we make sure the whole world knows what happened here." Sarah was already setting up her satellite communication equipment. "Live stream everything to every wildlife protection organization, every tribal council, every news outlet that will listen." The plan crystallized quickly. Rivers would document the capture operation and transmit evidence to federal authorities. Sarah would broadcast the confrontation in real time to generate public pressure and media attention. Elan would go down to the canyon floor and do whatever he could to protect the horses until help arrived. It was a desperate gamble, but it was also exactly what his ancestors would have done when faced with impossible odds. As he prepared to descend into the canyon, Elan thought about Maria's journal entries about living with horses in beautiful country. She would have understood this choice, would have supported his decision to fight for something larger than personal comfort or financial gain. The horses represented a dream she'd shared without him ever knowing it. The sacred war paint on his face felt warm in the morning sun as he checked his weapons, his grandfather's rifle, a handful of cartridges, and the spiritual strength that came from fighting for something sacred. It wasn't much against 20 armed professionals, but Apache warriors had won impossible victories with less. Stormwalker's call echoed from the canyon floor, a sound of warning and defiance that had echoed in this country for centuries. The great stallion knew the final confrontation was at hand, and he was gathering his herd for whatever came next. As Elan began his descent toward the canyon floor, he whispered a prayer his grandfather had taught him for times of great danger. "Ancestors, give me courage. Let me be worthy of the trust you've placed in me. Help me protect what cannot be replaced." The sun climbed higher, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and copper, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of rotors announced that the final battle for the last free horses was about to begin. Below him, 200 horses moved like liquid lightning through country their ancestors had claimed as home, when the world was young and freedom was still possible. The flare gun Samuel had kept in the barn's emergency kit felt heavy in Elan's hand as he crept through the boulder field toward the canyon floor. Above him, Sarah's voice carried on the wind as she broadcast live to wildlife protection organizations across the country, her satellite equipment turning this remote confrontation into a global event. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen, reporting from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico, where an illegal capture operation is underway against horses protected under federal treaty law. These animals represent irreplaceable genetic heritage dating back to the Plains Indian Wars, and they're being stolen by armed men working for Steel Development Corporation." Her words echoed off the canyon walls, providing a surreal soundtrack to the drama unfolding below. Steele's men had spread across the canyon floor in coordinated teams, their tranquilizer equipment and capture nets, creating an impenetrable barrier between the horses and their traditional escape routes. Stormwalker stood on a rocky promontory in the center of the canyon, his dark coat gleaming with sweat as he surveyed the tactical situation. The great stallion's intelligence was evident in every movement. He knew the trap was closing, but he also understood that panic would doom his herd. Instead, he kept them calm and organized, waiting for the right moment to attempt their escape. Elan reached the canyon floor just as the first capture team made their move. 3 men with tranquilizer guns approached a group of yearling colts that had become separated from the main herd. The young horses milled nervously, their inexperience making them easy targets for the professional rustlers. Without thinking, Elan raised the flare gun and fired. The projectile streaked across the canyon in a brilliant arc of red light, exploding against the rocks near the capture team. The men dove for cover, giving the yearlings time to rejoin the main herd. "Federal agents are en route," Elan shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "This is illegal capture on treaty-protected land." Clayton Webb emerged from behind a boulder, his face twisted with anger. "Yazzie! You're interfering with a legitimate wildlife management operation." "Bullshit," Elan called back. "You murdered my uncle, and now you're stealing horses that have been under my family's protection for over a century." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the flare. Several of Webb's men looked uncertain. They'd been told this was a legal capture operation, not knowing they were participating in the aftermath of murder. Stormwalker chose that moment to make his move. With a piercing whistle that echoed off the canyon walls, he led his herd in a coordinated charge toward the narrowest part of the canyon, the same route their ancestors had used to escape cavalry pursuits over a century ago. But Steele's people were ready. A helicopter appeared at the canyon mouth, its rotor wash creating a wall of dust and noise that stopped the horses' advance. Ground teams closed from both sides, their nets and tranquilizer guns creating an inescapable trap. That's when Dawn Singer's newborn colt stumbled. The hours-old foal, exhausted by the chase and overwhelmed by the chaos, went down in a tangle of long legs and confusion. Dawn Singer immediately moved to protect her baby, placing herself between the colt and the approaching capture teams. Her protective instincts made her an easy target for the tranquilizer guns. "No!" Sarah's voice carried from the rim as she witnessed the drama through her binoculars. "That mare just gave birth. The drugs could kill both her and the foal." Elan was already running toward Dawn Singer's position, his grandfather's rifle in his hands. The mare's courage in protecting her newborn embodied everything the horses represented: the refusal to surrender, the willingness to sacrifice for family, the determination to remain free no matter the cost. Webb's men saw him coming and raised their own weapons. For a moment that stretched like eternity, armed men faced each other across a canyon floor where wild horses milled in desperate confusion. The standoff balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move would trigger violence that could destroy everything Samuel had spent his life protecting. "Stand down," Webb shouted to his men. "Take the old man alive. We need him to sign transfer documents." The revelation that they planned to force him to legitimize the theft added another layer of corruption to the operation. This wasn't just about capturing horses, it was about creating legal cover for theft and murder. Above them, the sound of additional helicopters announced the arrival of federal agents. The FBI had apparently taken Sarah's broadcast seriously, responding with the kind of overwhelming force that suggested they understood the national significance of what was happening in this remote canyon. But the federal response was still minutes away. And in those minutes, the genetic heritage of 5 centuries could be lost forever. Dawn Singer stood over her fallen colt, her sides heaving with exhaustion and terror, while Stormwalker rallied the scattered herd for one final attempt at escape. The sacred war paint on Elan's face caught the morning light as he raised his grandfather's rifle, knowing that what happened in the next few moments would determine whether the last free horses of the American West would live or die in captivity. The ancient Apache war cry that erupted from Elan's throat echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, a sound that hadn't been heard in this country for over a century. The horses responded immediately. Not with fear, but with recognition. This was the voice of their protectors, the sound their ancestors had known when Apache warriors rode beside them into battle. Stormwalker's answering call rallied the scattered herd as federal helicopters appeared on the horizon, their distinctive markings clearly visible against the morning sky. But they were still minutes away, and Dawn Singer's colt was struggling to stand, while tranquilizer-armed men closed in from all sides. "FBI, drop your weapons and step away from the animals." The voice boomed from speakers mounted on the lead federal helicopter, but Webb's men were trapped now between their illegal operation and the arriving authorities. Some began to surrender, throwing down their equipment and raising their hands. Others, realizing the magnitude of the federal crimes they'd been involved in, made desperate attempts to complete the capture before the agents could intervene. Elan reached Dawn Singer, just as one of Webb's men raised his tranquilizer gun toward the exhausted mare. Without hesitation, Elan tackled the man, sending them both sprawling in the red dirt as the dart went wide. They struggled briefly before the rustler fled toward the waiting vehicles. Above them, Sarah's broadcast had created a media sensation. News outlets across the country were picking up her live feed, turning the remote canyon confrontation into a national story. The illegal capture of heritage horses, the murder allegations, and the federal treaty violations were creating a political firestorm that reached all the way to Washington. Stormwalker led the main herd in a coordinated escape through passages that Steele's men hadn't anticipated. The great stallion's lifetime of experience in this country gave him advantages that no amount of equipment could overcome. He knew every hidden trail, every water source, every sanctuary that generations of horses had used to survive in the harsh desert landscape. As federal agents rappelled from helicopters and swarmed across the canyon floor, the scope of Steele's operation became clear. This wasn't just horse rustling. It was an organized conspiracy involving millions of dollars in equipment, dozens of personnel, and connections to black market animal trafficking networks that spanned international borders. Clayton Webb made one final desperate attempt to reach Dawn Singer and her colt. The mare was the key to the entire genetic treasure. Her bloodlines were the purest, and her newborn represented the future of the heritage breed. If he could capture just those two animals, the operation wouldn't be a complete loss, but he hadn't counted on the community response that Sarah's broadcast had generated. Vehicles were arriving from all directions, tribal council members from multiple pueblos, wildlife conservationists, local ranchers who respected the horse's place in the ecosystem, and reporters drawn by the developing story. Tom Whitehorse arrived with a truck full of tribal police officers, their jurisdiction over treaty lands giving them authority to arrest anyone involved in the illegal operation. Beth Martinez brought supplies for the animals and additional veterinary support for any horses that had been injured during the chaos. The tide had turned decisively. What began as a coordinated assault on the last free horses had become a rallying point for everyone who believed some things were more valuable than money. Dr. Rivers emerged from his hiding place with digital evidence of the entire operation, including recordings of Webb's men discussing the murder of Samuel and the planned disposal of witnesses. The genetic test results, combined with the documented crimes, created an ironclad case for federal prosecution. As FBI agents placed Webb and his associates under arrest, Marcus Steele himself appeared on the canyon rim, watching his elaborate plan collapse in spectacular fashion. Even from a distance, his rage was palpable. Millions of dollars in equipment impounded, associates facing federal charges, and the horses still free under the protection of federal law. Stormwalker stood on his rocky promontory as the chaos subsided, his dark coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The great stallion seemed to understand that the immediate threat had passed, but his alertness never wavered. Freedom, once lost, was almost impossible to regain. Dawn Singer's colt struggled to his feet with his mother's gentle encouragement, his unsteady legs gradually finding their strength. The newborn's survival symbolized more than just one horse's life. It represented the continuation of bloodlines that connected the present to the sacred past. Federal agents secured the scene, and tribal elders performed thanksgiving ceremonies for the horse's protection. Elan felt the presence of his ancestors in the wind that moved through the canyon. Samuel's sacrifice had not been in vain. The horses would remain free, their genetic heritage protected by federal law and tribal treaty rights. The last wild horses of the American West had survived their greatest test, and in doing so, they had reminded a watching world that some things could not be captured, commodified or controlled. Freedom, like the wind itself, belonged to no one and everyone, and it would endure as long as there were those willing to protect it. The war cry that had echoed through the canyon that morning became a song of victory carried on the evening breeze. 6 months after the battle in the canyon, Elan stood on the same rocky outcrop where Stormwalker had kept his vigil, watching the evening sun paint the mesas in shades of gold and crimson. The document in his hands still felt surreal, an official federal designation establishing the Crow's Rest Wild Horse Sanctuary as a protected area under joint management by the Apache Nation and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The sanctuary now encompassed not just Samuel's original property, but 12,000 acres of adjacent federal and tribal land, creating a protected ecosystem large enough to support the horse's natural migration patterns. The deed of trust ensured that the land would remain wild forever, managed according to traditional Apache principles and modern conservation science. Sarah emerged from the newly constructed visitor center, her arms full of educational materials for the group of tribal youth who'd come to learn about traditional horsemanship. The center itself was a marvel of sustainable design, solar-powered, built with local materials, and designed to blend seamlessly with the landscape rather than dominate it. The University of New Mexico group wants to extend their genetic research project for another 5 years, she said, joining him on the Overlook. They're calling it the most significant discovery in equine genetics in 50 years. Elan smiled, watching Dawn Singer graze with her 6-month-old colt in the meadow below. The young horse had grown strong and confident, already showing the fluid grace that marked him as one of the special ones. Sarah had named him Promise Keeper, recognizing his role as a bridge between past and future. The transformation of the ranch had been remarkable. Federal grants, tribal funding, and private donations had created infrastructure that supported both horse protection and cultural education. Visitors came from around the world to see the horses and learn about Apache traditions, but the numbers were carefully controlled to minimize impact on the animals. Tom Whitehorse called this morning, Sarah continued. 3 more ranches in the area want to participate in the Conservation Corridor project. If we can connect their properties with conservation easements, we'll have an unbroken habitat stretching from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the Rio Grande Valley. The Conservation Corridor was Elan's proudest achievement, a network of protected lands that allowed wildlife to move freely across traditional migration routes. The horses were the flagship species, but the project protected habitat for elk, antelope, and dozens of smaller animals whose survival depended on connected ecosystems. A group of teenage Apache students approached from the direction of the corrals, led by Joseph Crowfeather Rose's grandson. The young man had spent the summer learning traditional horse training methods, combining ancient Apache techniques with modern animal psychology. His natural talent reminded Elan of his own grandfather's stories about young warriors who seemed born to work with horses. "Uncle Elan," Joseph called, using the respectful address for tribal elders. The horses are ready for the sunset ceremony. The evening ceremony had become a daily tradition, a time when visitors and staff gathered to honor the horses and reflect on the day's lessons. Elan had adapted it from ceremonies his grandfather had described, creating a modern expression of ancient relationships between Apache people and horses. As they walked toward the ceremonial area, Elan's thoughts turned to the legal battles that had raged for months after the canyon confrontation. Marcus Steele and his associates faced federal charges, including conspiracy, murder, violation of tribal treaty rights, and illegal trafficking in protected animals. The trials had generated national attention, exposing corruption that reached into state and federal agencies. Clayton Webb had plea bargained for a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against Steele and revealing the network of buyers who'd been willing to pay millions for horses with heritage bloodlines. The investigation had uncovered similar operations in 3 other states, leading to the rescue of dozens of horses and the strengthening of federal protection laws. But the legal victories were less important to Elan than the cultural renewal the sanctuary had sparked. Young Apache people were rediscovering traditional relationships with horses, learning skills and stories that had been in danger of disappearing forever. The horses had become teachers, connecting new generations to ancestral wisdom. Sarah had moved to the ranch permanently, accepting a position as the sanctuary's head veterinarian and research coordinator. Their relationship had deepened naturally, built on shared purpose and mutual respect, rather than the desperate attraction of crisis. At 62 and 55, respectively, they approached love with the patience and appreciation that came with understanding how precious such connections were. Maria would have loved this place, Elan said as they reached the ceremonial circle where visitors and staff gathered each evening. "She did love it," Sarah replied gently. "Through you. Every choice you made to protect these horses honored the dreams she wrote about in her journal." The ceremony began as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in colors that had inspired Apache artists for centuries. Stormwalker led his herd to the watering hole, their movement a living demonstration of the freedom that the sanctuary protected. The great stallion had never lost his wild dignity, But he'd learned to accept the presence of humans who treated him with respect. As Elan spoke about the day's observations and the lessons the horses taught, he felt the presence of all the ancestors who'd contributed to this moment. His grandfather, who'd kept the stories alive. Samuel, who'd sacrificed everything to protect the horses. Maria, who'd dreamed of living among beautiful animals in wide-open country. The sanctuary represented more than conservation. It was proof that traditional wisdom and modern science could work together to protect what mattered most. The horses moved through their domain as their ancestors had for centuries, free but protected, wild but honored. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast New Mexico sky, Promise Keeper called to his mother with the voice of innocence and hope. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, carrying forward the ancient song of freedom that would continue as long as there were those willing to listen and protect. The last wild horses of the American West had found their sanctuary, and in protecting them, Elan had discovered his own.